The dust had a way of settling into everything in Silver Creek, Montana. It crept through the gaps in the floorboards, coated the windows in a perpetual film, and turned even the finest Sunday clothes a dingy brown within hours. Thomas Hale had long since given up fighting it. As he sat on his porch that September morning in 1872, watching the sun crawl over the distant mountains, he let the dust be just like he'd let most things be since Martha died. The letter in his weathered hands promised something different, something clean and new and untouched by the harshness of this God-forsaken territory. Miss Catherine Mills, it read, aged 22, of good Christian upbringing from Ohio, experienced in household management, eager for matrimony and children. The matrimonial agency in Chicago had been specific about her virtues: pure, obedient, skilled in the womanly arts. Virgin, though they'd used more delicate language to convey that particular selling point. Thomas folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Today was the day. After 6 months of correspondence and a considerable sum wired to Chicago, his mail-order bride would arrive on the afternoon stage. He'd paid extra for what the agency called a premium match, a young woman of impeccable character who could give him the family Martha never could before the fever took her. "You're a fool, Thomas Hale," he muttered to himself, the words lost in the vastness of his ranch. 500 head of cattle grazed in the valley below, tended by a handful of cowhands who lived in the bunkhouse a quarter-mile from the main house. It was a profitable operation, one of the most successful in the county. But what good was success when you ate your meals alone and spoke mostly to horses? He stood, joints protesting after 40 minutes of stillness, and walked through his house one more time. He'd spent the last week preparing for her arrival. The floors were scrubbed, the windows washed, fresh linens on the bed in what would be her room at least until she felt comfortable sharing his. He'd even had Mrs. Patterson from town come out to help him stock the pantry properly. The old widow had clucked her tongue at his bachelor ways, but helped nonetheless, filling his shelves with flour, sugar, preserves, and other necessities a woman would expect. The house felt different already, charged with possibility. 6 rooms that had echoed with emptiness for 3 years suddenly seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. He'd built this place with his own hands, with Martha's dreams guiding every nail and board. The parlor with its eastern-facing windows where she'd wanted to do her needlework. The kitchen large enough for the family meals she'd planned. The 3 empty bedrooms upstairs, waiting for children who never came. Thomas checked his pocket watch, a gift from Martha on their wedding day. noon, the stage usually arrived around 3, give or take, depending on road conditions and whether the Thornton boys had been causing trouble again near Devil's Bend. He had time to wash up and change into his good suit, the one he wore for church on the rare Sundays he attended. At the washstand, he studied his reflection in the small mirror. 38 years had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His dark hair, which Martha used to say reminded her of coffee beans, now showed silver at the temples. His hands were rough, permanently stained by work. The hands of a man who'd built his fortune one calf at a time. What would a young woman from Ohio make of him? Would she see the successful rancher with one of the largest spreads in the territory? Or just another weathered widower trying to buy what he couldn't earn? Don't matter now, he told his reflection. Deal's been made. He dressed carefully in his black wool suit, fighting with the collar that seemed determined to choke him. His boots, polished to an unlikely shine, felt strange on his feet. He was more accustomed to worn leather caked with mud and worse. The final touch was a splash of bay rum cologne, though he immediately regretted it. The scent seemed too eager, too obvious. By 2 o'clock, he was sitting on a bench outside Morrison's general store, trying not to fidget. The town of Silver Creek sprawled before him in all its dubious glory, a main street of packed dirt. 2 saloons, the general store, a boarding house that doubled as a brothel, though nobody spoke of that openly, the church, the schoolhouse, and a scattering of other businesses. Rough men lounged outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. Cowboys mostly, waiting for their next job or drinking away their last pay. "Afternoon, Mr. Hale," called out Josiah Morrison from the doorway of his store. "Heard you got something special coming in on today's stage." Thomas nodded curtly. News traveled fast in a town of barely 200 souls. "Just some business from back east," he said, knowing full well that Josiah, and likely half the town, knew exactly what kind of business. Course. Josiah grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Though I heard from Mrs. Morrison, who heard from Mrs. Patterson, that you've been fixing up your place something fierce. New curtains and all." Thomas didn't respond. Let them talk. They'd been talking about him for 3 years anyway, poor Thomas Hale. Lost his wife. Rattles around in that big house like a ghost. Maybe they'd have something new to gossip about after today. The afternoon wore on. 3 o'clock came and went. Thomas checked his watch obsessively, each minute stretching like an hour. By 3:30, a kernel of worry had lodged in his chest. The stage was occasionally late, but rarely by this much unless there'd been trouble. 4 o'clock. The sun had begun its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. A few of the townspeople who'd found excuses to linger near the general store began to drift away, shooting him pitying glances. Thomas remained on his bench, back straight, eyes fixed on the road that led into town. It was nearly 5 when the stage finally appeared, a cloud of dust announcing its arrival long before the thunder of hooves and rattle of wheels reached the town. Thomas stood, brushing imaginary dirt from his suit. His heart, which he'd thought too scarred to race anymore, picked up its pace. The stage rolled to a stop in front of Morrison's, the horses heaving and lathered with sweat. Bad conditions on the road, by the look of it. The driver, a grizzled man named Hank Brewster, climbed down stiffly. "Sorry for the delay, folks," Hank called out. "Had to take the long way round. Bridge at Miller's Crossing washed out in that storm last week." Thomas barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the stage door as Hank opened it and offered his hand to help the passengers down. First came a traveling salesman Thomas recognized. Then an elderly couple he didn't. His breath caught as a feminine hand emerged, taking Hank's assistance. But the woman who stepped down was all wrong. Where he'd expected youth, he saw experience. Where he'd anticipated delicate features and modest bearing, he found curves that her travel dress couldn't hide and a direct gaze that seemed to take in the entire town in one sweeping glance. Her hair, rather than the corn silk blonde he'd imagined, was a rich auburn that caught fire in the late afternoon sun. She was handsome, certainly, but handsome like a thoroughbred horse or a well-made rifle, striking but decidedly not the blushing virgin bride he'd paid for. She was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two older, with the kind of bearing that suggested she'd seen more of life than any properly raised young lady should. When her eyes found his, and somehow she seemed to know exactly who he was, they held neither the shy, downcast look he'd expected nor the eager brightness of a young bride. Instead, there was something like resignation mixed with determination. "No," Thomas said, the word escaping before he could stop it. "There's been a mistake." The woman's lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile. Thomas Hale. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, with a slight rasp that spoke of dusty roads and hard living. "I'm Margaret Doyle. Most folks call me Maggie." "You're not." He stopped, aware they were drawing attention. "Where's Miss Mills, Catherine Mills?" "Dead," Maggie said simply, setting down a worn carpet bag that seemed to contain all her worldly possessions. "Took fever in Chicago 2 weeks back. The agency sent me instead." She pulled a letter from her pocket and held it out. "It's all explained here." Thomas took the letter with numb fingers but didn't open it. "The agency sent you, but I paid for—" Again he stopped, heat rising in his face. "You paid for a virgin bride," Maggie finished, loud enough that several passers-by turned to stare. "Young, untouched, ready to be molded into the perfect frontier wife. Instead, you got me a widow who's buried one husband and seen enough of life to know fairy tales don't come true. The agency thought you'd prefer any woman to no woman at all. Seems they were wrong." Thomas felt the weight of the town's eyes upon them. This was not a conversation to have in the middle of Main Street. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he said stiffly. "Perhaps we should." Maggie picked up her carpet bag. "Your wagon, I assume?" She nodded toward his buckboard tied up outside the store. He could refuse. He could put her right back on the stage when it left tomorrow morning, demand his money back from the agency. That would be the sensible thing. But something in the way she stood there, not pleading, not apologizing, just waiting, made him pause. That and the growing crowd of onlookers eager for drama. "This way," he said curtly, taking her bag despite himself. It weighed almost nothing. They rode out of town in silence. The only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady plod of the horses. Thomas kept his eyes fixed ahead, acutely aware of the woman beside him. She smelled of dust and travel, but underneath was something else, lavender, perhaps, or some other flower he couldn't name. It was disconcerting. When Silver Creek had shrunk to a collection of tiny buildings behind them, Maggie finally spoke. "You have every right to be angry." "I'm not angry." Thomas lied. "I'm confused. The agency specifically promised—" "A young virgin bride," Maggie interrupted. "Yes, I gathered that from your expression. Tell me, Mr. Hale, what exactly were you planning to do with this virgin? Train her like a horse, shape her like clay, create the perfect wife to replace the one you lost?" Thomas's hands tightened on the reins. "That's not... because that's what most men want when they order a bride, like a piece of merchandise. Someone who doesn't know enough to complain when life out here turns out to be harder than they imagined. Someone who hasn't learned her own mind yet. You don't know anything about me or what I want." "I know you're a widower," Maggie said, her voice gentling slightly. "I know you've got a successful ranch. The agency was very clear about your assets. I know you live alone and want children. And I know you're the kind of man who thinks he can buy what he's lost instead of earning what he needs." They'd reached the gate to his property. Thomas stopped the wagon to open it, using the pause to gather his thoughts. When he climbed back up, he finally looked at her directly. "And what about you, Mrs. Doyle? What kind of woman takes another's place without a word of apology? What kind of widow travels across the country to marry a stranger?" "The desperate kind," she said simply. "The kind with nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. My husband's been dead 2 years. Mr. Hale, I've spent that time discovering just how few options a woman has when she's got no family, no money, and a reputation that's been thoroughly destroyed by wagging tongues." "What happened to your husband?" "Shot dead in a dispute over water rights. He was trying to build something in New Mexico, same as you've built here. Except he wasn't as lucky, or maybe wasn't as smart. Either way, I was left with debts I couldn't pay, and neighbors who thought a young widow was fair game for all sorts of propositions." They were approaching the house now, and Thomas saw her straighten, taking in the sizable 2-story structure with its wraparound porch and glass windows that had cost a fortune to freight in from Denver. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "It's too big for one person," Thomas admitted, then wished he hadn't. He pulled up in front of the house and helped her down, noting the calluses on her palms. Whatever else she wasn't afraid of work. They stood awkwardly in front of the porch steps, neither moving. "Look," Maggie said finally, "I know I'm not what you wanted, not by a long shot. But I'm here, and I've got nowhere else to go. I can cook, clean, tend livestock. And I've helped birth more calves than I can count. I don't need training or coddling. And I won't faint at the sight of blood or hard work. Give me a month, that's all I ask. If you still want to send me back after that, I'll go without complaint. But maybe you'll find that what you need isn't what you thought you wanted." Thomas studied her face in the dying light. There was pride there, but also a vulnerability she was trying hard to hide. She was right, she wasn't what he'd wanted. He'd wanted someone young and malleable, someone who would slip into Martha's place without disturbing the careful order he'd built around his grief. Instead, he'd gotten this flame-haired widow who seemed likely to disturb everything. 1 month, he heard himself say. You can have the room at the top of the stairs, second door on the right. We'll maintain appropriate boundaries unless we decide to make the arrangement permanent. Fair enough. Relief flickered across her features before she schooled them back to composure. More than fair. Thank you, Mr. Hale. Thomas, he said, if you're going to live in my house, you might as well use my name. Thomas, then. She picked up her carpetbag and started up the steps, then paused. You paid for a virgin mail-order bride, she said, not turning around. But maybe fate knew better. Maybe what you need is a woman who's already been broken and put herself back together. Someone who knows that love isn't about innocence. It's about choosing to trust again despite the scars. She went inside before he could respond, leaving him standing in his own front yard, wondering how his carefully planned future had veered so far off course in the span of a single afternoon. The sound of her footsteps on his stairs that had been silent for 3 years echoed through the open door like a challenge. Or maybe, he thought as he finally followed her inside, like a promise. The first morning came with the sound of pans clattering in the kitchen before dawn. Thomas jerked awake, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar noise. For 3 years, his mornings had begun in silence, broken only by his own movements as he fixed coffee and cold biscuits before heading out to check on the herd. But now there were footsteps below, the scrape of a stove lid being lifted, the splash of water in the sink. Maggie, the widow who'd taken Catherine Mill's place. He dressed quickly and descended the stairs, pausing in the kitchen doorway. She stood at the stove with her back to him, her auburn hair pinned up in a practical bun that exposed the pale curve of her neck. She'd traded yesterday's travel-worn dress for a simple calico work dress that, despite its modesty, couldn't hide the fullness of her figure, where he'd imagined a slim young bride who might need encouraging to eat enough for the hard frontier life. Here was a woman whose body spoke of strength and capability. Coffee's almost ready, she said without turning. Biscuits will be done in 10 minutes. I found bacon in the cold cellar. Hope you don't mind I took the liberty. I usually just eat cold leftovers, I'd wager. She turned then, fixing him with those direct hazel eyes. A man who works as hard as you needs a proper breakfast. Sit. It wasn't a request. Thomas found himself settling at his own kitchen table like a guest, watching as she moved efficiently around the space. She'd only been here 1 night, but already she'd identified where everything was stored. The coffee she poured was strong and black, just as he liked it. The biscuits that emerged from the oven were golden and fragrant, nothing like the heavy lumps he managed when he bothered to try. You can cook, he said unnecessarily. Among other things. She set a loaded plate before him, eggs, bacon, biscuits with butter and jam. A widow learns to do everything or she doesn't survive. I've been cook, laundress, midwife, horse doctor, and field hand when needed. And now, she poured her own coffee and sat across from him. Now I'm whatever you need me to be, within reason, though I draw the line at pretending to be an innocent young miss who doesn't know which end of a bull is which. Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. Martha would never have spoken so plainly. But then, Martha had been raised in genteel circumstances back east, playing piano in her parents' parlor. This woman had clearly lived a different sort of life. Tell me about New Mexico, he said, surprising himself. About your husband. Maggie's face clouded. James was a dreamer, always talking about the empire he'd built, the dynasty he'd found. He had grand plans, but not much sense of how to achieve them. Thought he could charm his way past every obstacle. She paused, sipping her coffee. Turns out you can't charm a bullet. The water rights dispute, was it justified? Does it matter dead is dead, justified or not? The man who shot him claimed James diverted water from his stream. James claimed the water was on our property to begin with. The law sided with the man still breathing. There was a hardness in her voice that hadn't been there before. Thomas recognized it, the same edge that crept into his own when people asked about Martha's death. Some wounds scabbed over but never truly healed. And after, he prompted gently, after I discovered that James had been living on borrowed money and borrowed time, the ranch, such as it was, went to pay debts. Everything else got picked over by vultures, some wearing suits, some wearing spurs. A young widow with no male protection becomes everybody's business and nobody's responsibility. So you answered a matrimonial advertisement. Eventually, after I'd tried everything else respectable and a few things that weren't, she met his eyes steadily. I'm not proud of everything I've done to survive, Thomas, but I'm not ashamed either. We all do what we must. Before he could respond, the sound of horses approaching made them both turn toward the window. 3 of his ranch hands were riding up Jake Morrison, a steady older man who served as his foreman, and the Svensson brothers, Eric and Lars, young Swedes who worked hard and complained little. Best I meet your man, Maggie said, rising. They'll talk regardless. Might as well give them the truth to chew on. Thomas couldn't argue with her logic, though he wasn't eager for the encounter. He led her out onto the porch as the men dismounted. Jake's weathered face showed surprise, but no judgment. The Svensson brothers, both in their 20s, stared openly at Maggie with expressions Thomas didn't care for. Boys, this is Mrs. Doyle, Thomas said firmly. She'll be helping with the household management for a spell. Ma'am. Jake touched his hat brim politely. The brothers mumbled greetings, still gawking. Maggie descended the porch steps, moving with a confidence that made her simple calico dress seem like armor. Mr. Morrison, is it Thomas mentioned he had a good foreman, and you boys must be the Svenssons he spoke of? Thomas hadn't mentioned any of them to her, but the men didn't know that. Jake actually smiled. Yes, ma'am. Welcome to the Double H. Thank you. I wonder if one of you might help me later. I noticed the chicken coop needs repairs. And while I'm handy with a hammer, some jobs need a man's strength. Eric can help you, ma'am. Jake volunteered before either brother could speak. He's good with carpentry. Much obliged. She turned that direct gaze on Eric, who actually took a step back. After your regular duties, of course, I wouldn't want to interfere with the real work of the ranch. It was smoothly done. In 5 minutes, she'd established herself as the lady of the house while making it clear she wasn't putting on airs. As the men rode off to their duties, Thomas found himself reluctantly impressed. You handled that well. I've had practice. Ranch hands are the same everywhere. Treat them with respect, but don't let them get familiar. And they'll work themselves to death for you. She paused. Those Swedish boys will bear watching, though young men far from home sometimes get foolish ideas about widows. The rest of the morning passed in a strange dance of domestic negotiation. Maggie explored the house with the thoroughness of a general surveying a battlefield. Making mental notes, Thomas could almost see her filing away. She found Martha's preserves in the pantry and held up a jar of peach jam with raised eyebrows. Your late wife's? Yes, I haven't had the heart to throw them out. No need to. Good jam is good jam, regardless of who made it. She set the jar back carefully. Though I'll be making my own come next season. My apple butter won prizes at the county fair in Las Cruces 3 years running. By noon, she'd reorganized the kitchen to her liking, started bread dough rising, and mended 3 of his shirts he hadn't even realized needed attention. Thomas, who'd planned to work on account books, found himself watching her instead. She moved through his house like she'd always belonged there. Yet, somehow, without erasing Martha's presence, it was unsettling and oddly comforting at once. The trip to town that afternoon was her idea. I need supplies if I'm to cook properly, she announced. And it's best to face the gossips head on. Hiding only makes them talk more. Thomas wanted to argue, but couldn't fault her reasoning. He hitched up the wagon again, noting how she climbed up without waiting for his help. Martha had always paused, allowing him to hand her up like a lady. Maggie just gathered her skirts and hauled herself aboard. Silver Creek was busy for a weekday. Word of yesterday's stage arrival had clearly spread, and Thomas spotted several women who rarely had business in town lingering outside shops. Maggie sat straighter as they rolled down Main Street, her chin lifting slightly. "Vultures?" she murmured. "Every town has them." They stopped first at Morrison's general store, Josiah's wife. Prudence was behind the counter, her thin face alive with curiosity. 3 other women clustered near the fabric display, pretending to examine bolts of cloth. Mrs. Morrison," Maggie said pleasantly. "I'm Mrs. Doyle. I'll be needing supplies for the Hale Ranch." "Mrs. Doyle." Prudence's tone could have frosted windows. "We heard a Miss Mills was expected." "Life rarely delivers what's expected," Maggie replied. "I'll need flour, sugar, salt pork, and whatever vegetables you have fresh. Oh, and bluing for laundry." She conducted her business as if unaware of the whispers starting behind her. Thomas stood awkwardly by the door, fighting the urge to flee. This was why he avoided town: the looks, the speculation, the judgment rendered in glances and sniffs. "Is it true you're from New Mexico?" one of the women finally asked. Thomas recognized her as Mrs. Clarence Hartwell, wife of the bank president and self-appointed moral guardian of Silver Creek. "Yes," Maggie said, examining onions with apparent fascination. "And you're a widow?" "Yes." "How unfortunate to lose one's husband so young." Maggie looked up then, meeting Mrs. Hartwell's eyes directly. "Indeed, almost as unfortunate as losing one's wife, I'd imagine, but we survive, don't we? We endure what must be endured and make the best of what remains." The shop fell silent. Thomas saw something pass between the women, a recognition, perhaps, of iron meeting iron. Mrs. Hartwell looked away first. "I suppose we do," she said stiffly. They made 2 more stops, the butcher shop and the feed store. At each location, Maggie met curiosity with calm directness, neither explaining nor apologizing for her presence. By the time they headed home, Thomas's jaw ached from clenching it. "That wasn't as bad as it could have been," Maggie observed. "You call that not bad?" "Nobody threw anything. Nobody called me names to my face. In some towns I've been through. That counts as a warm welcome." She glanced at him. "You hate it, the scrutiny, the gossip. That's why you live out here like a hermit." "I live out here because I have a ranch to run." The sound conveyed polite disbelief. "Well, they'll talk themselves out eventually. Next week some cowboy will shoot another over cards, or someone's daughter will run off with a traveling salesman, and we'll be old news." That evening, Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the mountains crimson. She'd changed into a different dress, still practical, but a softer blue that brought out green flints in her hazel eyes. Her hair was loose, falling in waves past her shoulders. "It's beautiful here," she said as he joined her. "Different from New Mexico, greener, more hopeful, somehow." Martha loved the sunsets, said they reminded her of watercolors. "Tell me about her." The request surprised him. Most people avoided the subject of his late wife, but something in Maggie's tone, gentle but matter-of-fact, made it seem natural. She was delicate, like china, beautiful and refined and utterly unsuited for this life, though she tried. Lord, how she tried. The words came slowly at first, then faster. She played piano and painted and knew how to serve tea properly, could discuss poetry and politics with equal ease. Her father was a judge in Philadelphia. What was she doing out here? Following me, We met when I was back east buying breeding stock. I was young and cocky, and she thought I was romantic, the bold Westerner taming the frontier. He laughed bitterly. Neither of us knew what we were really signing up for. But you loved each other. Yes, despite everything. Yes, she never complained, even when the life out here started wearing her down. The isolation, the work, the failed pregnancies. He stopped, realizing he'd said more than intended. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Children change everything. Having them, losing them, wanting them, and not having them, it all leaves marks. Did you and your husband... One. A boy. He lived 3 days. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted in her lap. The doctor said it was just one of those things that happens, as if that made it easier. They sat in silence as the sky deepened from crimson to purple. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another. The night sounds of the ranch began: cattle lowing, horses nickering, the creak of the windmill. I should start dinner, Maggie said finally. I'm not very hungry. You will be when you smell what I'm cooking. She stood, brushing off her skirt. Thomas, thank you for today. For standing by me in town. You could have left me to face them alone. You're under my protection now. Whatever else happens, that means something. She studied him in the gathering darkness. You're a good man, Thomas Hale. Martha was lucky to have you, even if the life was hard. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with the ghosts that seemed less oppressive somehow. From the kitchen came the sounds of dinner preparation, the sizzle of meat in a pan, the ring of stove lids, the melody of a woman humming. It wasn't Martha's timid presence trying to fit into a life too large for her. This was something else, a force of nature making itself at home. Over dinner, venison steaks with gravy, fresh bread, and green beans she'd somehow conjured from his neglected garden, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in months. Maggie had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like prying, and her own stories were peppered with dry observations that surprised him into laughter. So there I was, she said, describing a cattle drive she'd helped with after James died. Covered in mud, trying to convince these cowboys I knew what I was doing. One of them, a big Texan named Bull, decided to test me. Brought over the meanest horse in the remuda. Said if I could ride him, he'd follow my orders. And I rode him, mostly because I was too stubborn to admit I was terrified. Lost some skin and gained some bruises, but Bull kept his word. Later, he told me I reminded him of his grandmother, tough as saddle leather and twice as ornery. Thomas laughed, a real laugh that seemed to surprise them both. I'd like to have seen that. No, you wouldn't. I was a sight mud in my hair, clothes torn, vocabulary that would have made a sailor blush. Not exactly the picture of feminine grace. Feminine grace is overrated, Thomas heard himself say. Maggie's eyes met his across the table. Careful, Mr. Hale. That almost sounded like a compliment. Later, as she cleaned up, refusing his offer of help, Thomas retreated to his study, but concentration eluded him. He could hear her moving about, putting his house in order. She was nothing like he'd wanted, nothing like he'd planned for. Catherine Mills would have been a blank slate. Someone to mold into the perfect ranch wife. Someone who wouldn't challenge him or disturb the careful order he'd built around his grief. Maggie Doyle was no blank slate. She was a book already written, with chapters of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. She didn't need him to teach her about hardship or survival. If anything, she could probably teach him a thing or two. The thought should have troubled him more than it did. When he finally headed upstairs, he found her door closed, a line of light showing beneath it. He paused, hearing the quiet sound of movement within. For a moment, he imagined knocking, though for what purpose he couldn't say. Instead, he continued to his own room, where the bed that had felt merely empty for 3 years suddenly seemed vast and cold. Through the wall, he heard her moving about, preparing for bed. The intimacy of it, a woman's presence separated from him by mere wood and plaster, sent an unexpected heat through him. Not desire, exactly, or not only that, something more complex, composed of loneliness and possibility and the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to remain frozen in grief forever. Outside! That coyote howled again, a sound both mournful and defiant. Thomas lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of his ranch and the newer sound of another person breathing in his house, living in his space, disturbing his carefully preserved past. 1 month. He'd given her 1 month to prove herself. He had a feeling it wouldn't take nearly that long. The October wind had teeth that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a promise of early snow. Thomas stood at his bedroom window, watching the gray dawn creep across his land. 2 weeks had passed since Maggie's arrival. 2 weeks of a routine that felt both foreign and oddly comforting. The smell of coffee already drifted up from below, along with the quiet humming she did when she thought no one could hear. He dressed slowly, his fingers stiff with cold. The house had always been drafty, but he'd never minded before. A man alone didn't need much warmth. But lately, he'd caught himself noticing things: how Maggie pulled her shawl tighter in the evenings, how her hands sometimes trembled when she came in from feeding the chickens. Downstairs, he found her kneading bread dough, her movements rhythmic and sure. She'd pinned her hair up, but rebellious strands escaped to frame her face. The early morning light caught the auburn highlights, turning them to copper. "Storm coming," she said without looking up. "My bones know it. We should move the cattle from the north pasture." "Already planned on it." He poured his coffee, noting she'd added a touch of chicory the way he liked. "Jake and the boys will handle it." "I could help. I've worked cattle before." "No need." The response came automatically, though he couldn't say why the thought of her out in the coming storm bothered him. She looked up then, flour dusting her cheeks. "I'm not made of spun glass. Thomas, I won't break." "I know that." "Do you—" She went back to her kneading, putting more force behind it than necessary. "Sometimes I think you see all women as fragile things needing protection. Maybe that's easier than seeing us as we really are." He didn't answer, couldn't answer, because maybe she was right. Maybe it was easier to think of women as delicate creatures than to acknowledge their strength and what that strength might demand of him in return. The storm arrived by midday, earlier than expected. Thomas and his men barely got the cattle moved before the sky opened up. He returned to the house soaked and shivering, to find Maggie had built up the fires and laid out dry clothes for him. "Bath's heating," she said briskly. "You'll catch your death otherwise." He wanted to protest that he'd weathered worse, but the chattering of his teeth betrayed him. Half an hour later, warmed by hot water and dry clothes, he found her in the parlor, working on some mending by lamplight. The storm had turned day to twilight, rain lashing against the windows with increasing fury. "It's going to be a long one," she observed, not looking up from her needlework. "Hope your men made it back to the bunkhouse safely." "They know to hole up when weather turns bad." He settled into his chair across from her, the domesticity of the scene striking him. How many evenings had Martha spent in that same spot, doing that same task? But Martha's hands had moved hesitantly, often pricking herself, leaving tiny bloodstains on the fabric. Maggie's hands were confident, creating neat, even stitches without conscious thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "You get this look sometimes, like you're seeing through things to something else." "The past." "Ah." She tied off a thread, bit it with her teeth. "The past is a comfortable place to live. No surprises there, everything already decided, already known, safe." "You sound like you speak from experience." "We all live in the past sometimes. The trick is knowing when to visit and when to close the door." She picked up another shirt, one of his. He realized with a start. When had she begun mending his clothes without being asked? The storm intensified as evening approached. The windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere a shutter had come loose. banging rhythmically against the house. Thomas stood to go fix it, but Maggie stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Leave it. You'll only get soaked again. And for what? A little noise never hurt anyone." Her hand was warm through his shirt sleeve. He looked down at it, work-roughened but somehow still feminine, and felt something shift in his chest. She must have felt it too because she pulled away, color rising in her cheeks. "I should see about supper," she said, but made no move to leave. The lamp flickered as the wind found some crack to whistle through. The room suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. Thomas was acutely aware of her presence, the whisper of her breathing, the faint scent of lavender and bread dough that clung to her. "Maggie," he began, not sure what he meant to say. The lamp went out. Darkness descended like a curtain, broken only by the faint glow from the fireplace in the next room. He heard her quick intake of breath, felt rather than saw her stand. "I'll get another," she began, just as he said, "There are matches." They collided in the darkness. His hands came up instinctively to steady her, finding her waist, the curve of her hip. She was soft and warm, and suddenly very close. "Thomas," her voice was barely a whisper. He should step back, should light the lamp and restore proper distance between them, should remember that she was here on trial, that he barely knew her, that his heart was supposed to be buried with Martha. Instead, he found himself drawing her closer. "This is unwise," she breathed against his neck. "Yes, you're still in love with your wife." "Yes, and I'm not the woman you wanted." His hands tightened on her waist. "No, you're not." She pulled back slightly, and even in the darkness, he could sense her searching his face. Then why? Why indeed? Why did his blood run hot when she was near? Why did the house feel alive again for the first time in years? Why did he lie awake at night, achingly aware of her presence just down the hall? "Because," he said slowly, "you're not a ghost. You're not a memory. You're here, and you're real, and you make me remember what that feels like." She made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. "Is that enough being real?" Before he could answer, lightning split the sky, illuminating her face for one brilliant instant. Her eyes were wide, vulnerable in a way he'd never seen them. Then thunder crashed, shaking the house, and she pressed against him involuntarily. He held her through the reverberations, feeling her heart race against his chest. When it passed, she didn't pull away. "I'm not asking for love," she said quietly. "I know better than that. But I am asking for honesty. If this happens, I need to know it's not just because I'm convenient. I've been the convenient choice before. I won't be that again." "You're the least convenient thing that's ever happened to me," he said roughly. "You've disrupted everything, my house, my routine, my—" He stopped, unable to voice the last word. "My heart?" She lifted her hand to his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Good, you needed disrupting." He caught her hand, pressed it flat against his chest where his heart hammered. "I can't promise." "I'm not asking for promises. Just truth between us, for however long we have." The storm raged outside, but in the darkness of his parlor, there was a different kind of electricity. He bent his head, found her mouth with his. She tasted of coffee and something sweeter, something that made him think of spring despite the winter wind howling outside. It was not a gentle kiss. 3 years of loneliness poured into it, met by her own fierce need. Her fingers twisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and he backed her against the wall. Propriety be damned. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she laughed shakily. "Well, that was unplanned, unexpected, probably inadvisable." "Most definitely." But she was smiling. He could hear it in her voice. What now? What now indeed? He stepped back, putting space between them even though every fiber of his being protested. "Now we think. Now we take time. Time. She sighed. Always time. Very well. Thomas Hale. But know this, I'm not a patient woman by nature. And I'm not Martha. I won't wait quietly in the shadows for you to decide if I'm worthy of stepping into the light. Another lightning flash showed her straightening her dress, patting her hair back into place. By the time he'd fumbled for matches and relit the lamp, she'd composed herself completely. Only the high color in her cheeks and the slight swelling of her lips betrayed what had passed between them. "I'll see about supper," she said briskly. "The storm's likely to last all night. We'll need something substantial." She swept from the room, leaving him standing there, blood still running hot, wondering what he'd just set in motion. The empty house he'd inhabited for 3 years suddenly felt too full of possibility, of danger, of a future he hadn't asked for but might not be able to refuse. Through supper, a hearty stew she'd somehow kept warm. Despite the lamp crisis, they maintained careful distance. Conversation stayed safely on ranch matters, the storm, plans for the coming week, but awareness hummed between them like telegraph wire, electric and alive. Later, as she cleaned up, he fixed the loose shutter, needing the cold rain on his face to clear his head. When he came back in, soaked again, she was banking the fires for the night. "You'll catch your death one of these days," she said, not looking at him. "Would you care?" She paused, hands stilling on the poker. "Yes, I believe I would." They stood there, the width of the room between them, rain drumming on the roof. Finally. She set the poker aside and moved toward the stairs. "Good night, Thomas." "Good night, Maggie." At the foot of the stairs, she turned back. "That kiss, it changes things." "Yes. But not everything. Not yet." "No, not yet." She nodded, seeming satisfied with that, and climbed the stairs. He listened to her footsteps overhead, the creak of her door closing. Then he sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers, wondering if Martha would forgive him for the betrayal of wanting someone else, wondering if it was betrayal at all, or simply life insisting on continuing despite loss. The storm raged all night. He lay awake through most of it, acutely aware of the woman down the hall. Every creak of the house made him wonder if she too was awake, if she too was thinking about that kiss and what it meant for whatever came next. Toward dawn, the wind finally began to die. He must have dozed because he woke to pale sunlight and the smell of coffee. Downstairs, he found Maggie already at work, rolling out biscuit dough as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. He saw it in the way she held herself, a new awareness in her movements, felt it in his own response to her presence, no longer merely appreciative but actively wanting. "Storm passed," she said without looking up. "Yes. Left a mess, I'd wager. Fences down, debris everywhere." "Most likely." She finally met his eyes. "Storms do that, change the landscape, but the land endures. Things get rebuilt, sometimes stronger than before." He understood they weren't talking about weather anymore. Sometimes things get rebuilt different than they were. Different isn't always bad. "No, it's not." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. "Eat your breakfast. Thomas, you've got a ranch to put back together." He sat, let her serve him, tasted biscuits that seemed somehow better than yesterday's. Outside, puddles reflected the clearing sky, and his men were already emerging from the bunkhouse to survey the damage. There would be work to do, fences to mend, cattle to check, but for now, he sat in his kitchen with a woman who wasn't his wife but was becoming something else, something unnamed but no less real for its lack of definition. "Maggie." "I'm glad you're here." Her hand stilled for just a moment as she poured his coffee. Then she continued, steady as always. "So am I," she said quietly. "So am I." The stranger rode in on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the storm. Thomas noticed him first from the north pasture, where he was helping Jake repair fence lines, a lone rider on a bay horse, moving with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way he surveyed the ranch as he approached, made Thomas's instincts prickle. "Company," Jake observed, squinting against the afternoon sun. "Don't recognize the horse." Thomas straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'll head back. You finish here." He reached the house just as the stranger was dismounting at the front porch. Maggie stood in the doorway, her stance casual but alert. She'd developed a sixth sense for trouble in their weeks together. The man was perhaps 45, well-dressed for a frontier traveler, with cold gray eyes that swept over everything with proprietary interest. His clothes spoke of money-good cloth, silver spurs, a pistol with pearl handles that was more ornament than tool. "Help you?" Thomas asked, keeping his tone neutral. The stranger turned, a smile creasing his weather-beaten face. It didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas Hale, I'm Silas Crowley. Own the Broken Spur Ranch over in Cedar Valley." Thomas had heard the name. Crowley had a reputation for acquiring land by whatever means presented themselves, sometimes purchase, sometimes pressure, occasionally through methods that skirted the edge of legal. He offered a brief handshake, noting Crowley's soft palms. A man who directed rather than worked. "Long ride from Cedar Valley," Thomas observed. "Business brings me this way occasionally." Crowley's gaze slid past Thomas to where Maggie stood. "Though I admit, the scenery's improved since my last visit." Maggie descended the porch steps slowly. "Mr. Crowley." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thomas looked between them, saw recognition in both faces, saw something else in Maggie's, a carefully controlled fear. "Mrs. Doyle." Crowley touched his hat brim, mockery in the gesture. "Or should I say, Mrs. Hale, now congratulations on your arrangement." "We've met?" Thomas asked, though the answer was obvious. "Oh, yes." Crowley's smile widened. "Mrs. Doyle and I go way back. Her late husband and I had some business dealings in New Mexico. Shame what happened to him. Real shame." Maggie's face had gone pale beneath her sun-touched skin. "What do you want, Silas?" "Direct as always. I admired that about you. Margaret, among other things." He turned to Thomas. "You've got yourself a real spirited filly here. Hale, hope you know what you're getting into." Thomas stepped forward, putting himself slightly between Crowley and Maggie. "State your business or move along." "My business? Well now, that's complicated. See, I'm in the market for expansion. This whole valley's growing, and a man needs to grow with it or get left behind. You're spread here, it's perfectly positioned. Access to water, good grazing, established operations. The Double H isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price." Crowley's eyes glinted. "Or when circumstances change, markets shift, accidents happen. Sometimes a man finds himself needing to liquidate assets quickly." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas felt Maggie tense behind him. "Sometimes a man finds himself on the wrong end of a rifle for making threats," Thomas said quietly. Crowley laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. "Threats, I'm just observing how uncertain life can be out here. Why, poor James Doyle thought he had everything figured out. Good land, water rights all legal and proper. Even had himself a beautiful wife to warm his bed." His gaze slid to Maggie again. "Course, beauty can be a dangerous thing. Makes men do foolish things. Fight over what they can't have." "That's enough," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You've made your point. Now leave." "Leave, but I haven't had the tour yet. Heard you've made some improvements. Hale, maybe Mrs. Doyle could show me around. She always was hospitable." Thomas moved before conscious thought, his fist connecting with Crowley's jaw. The man staggered back, hand going to his face. eyes blazing with something between anger and satisfaction. "Now, that's interesting," Crowley said, working his jaw. "The grieving widower's got some fire left after all. Good. Makes things more sporting." "Hey, get off my land!" Crowley retrieved his hat from where it had fallen, brushed dust from the brim with deliberate care. "I'll be going, but this isn't over. I've got unfinished business in these parts, old debts to collect." He mounted his horse, looked down at them. "You picked a fighter. Mrs. Doyle. Question is, will he be enough? Last man wasn't." He rode away at an easy canter, leaving silence in his wake. Thomas turned to find Maggie gripping the porch rail, knuckles white. "You want to tell me what that was about?" She closed her eyes. "Can we go inside, please?" In the kitchen, she sank into a chair while he poured whiskey early for drinking, but his hands weren't quite steady. He set a glass before her, watched her drain half in one swallow. "Silas Crowley killed my husband," she said flatly. "Oh, he didn't pull the trigger himself. He's too clever for that. But he orchestrated it, sure as if he'd aimed the gun." Thomas sat across from her, waiting. He'd learned she'd talk when ready. Not before. James had water rights Crowley wanted. Good ones, senior to his claim. Crowley tried to buy them, but James refused. Then things started happening. Cattle poisoned, fences cut, barn fires. She stared into her glass. "I begged James to sell, to take what money we could get and start over somewhere else. But he was proud, stubborn, said no man would drive him off his own land." "What happened?" "Crowley started coming around when James was away, making comments, suggestions, said if I was nice to him, maybe he'd leave us be." Her jaw tightened. "I threatened to tell James." Crowley laughed, said James already knew that he'd offered to trade the water rights for me. Said James was considering it. Thomas felt rage rise in his throat. "That's a lie." "Maybe, maybe not." James was desperate by then, watching everything we'd built crumble. And Crowley, he knows how to find the cracks in people, work them wider. She poured another drink. "The day James died, he'd gone to town to meet with a lawyer, was going to file charges against Crowley for the harassment. He never made it. Someone shot him on the road, claimed it was self-defense, that James drew first. The shooter was one of Crowley's men, but nobody could prove it wasn't a fair fight. And after, Crowley offered to buy me out. Generous terms. He said all I had to do was sign papers and show him some gratitude. When I refused, he made sure every creditor called in their notes at once. I lost everything within a month." She met his eyes. "I thought I'd escaped him by coming here. Should have known better. Men like him don't forget when they don't get what they want." Thomas reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "He won't touch you here. You don't know him. He's patient, clever. He'll find ways to make your life hell until you either sell or—" She didn't finish. "Or what end up like James." Thomas shook his head. "I'm not James. I know men like Crowley. Dealt with them before. They're dangerous when they can work in shadows, but drag them into the light." He squeezed her hand. "We'll handle this." She turned her hand palm up, laced her fingers with his. "You could send me away. Would be safer." "Is that what you want?" "No." The word came quick, fierce. "No. I'm tired of running. Tired of men like him thinking they can take whatever they want. But I won't be the reason you lose everything. If you want me to go, you're not going anywhere." The certainty in his own voice surprised him. "Month's not up yet. You promised me that much." She laughed, shaky but real. "Always the businessman. All right, Thomas Hale. But you should know what you're risking." "I know." That evening, Thomas called Jake and the Svensson brothers to the house. If trouble was coming, they needed to be prepared. The men listened grimly as he outlined the situation, leaving out some of the more personal details of Maggie's history with Crowley. "I heard of him," Jake said. "Nothing good. Man's got a reputation for getting what he wants." "Not this time," Thomas said. "From now on, nobody rides alone. We post watch at night, and nobody from the Broken Spur sets foot on this property." Eric Svensson spoke up. "Mrs. Doyle, is she in danger?" Thomas noticed the concern in the young man's voice, filed it away. "We're all in danger if we're not careful. But yes, she's of particular interest to Crowley." "We'll watch out for her," Lars said firmly. His brother nodded agreement. After the men left, Thomas found Maggie on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. She'd been quiet through dinner, lost in thoughts he could only guess at. "Thank you," she said as he joined her, "for believing me, for not judging." "Nothing to judge. You survived. Did what you had to." Some would say a decent woman would have chosen differently. Some would say a lot of things. Doesn't make them right. He studied her profile in the fading light. "Were you really going to leave?" "If you'd asked me to, yes. This is your home, your land. I wouldn't see you lose it for my troubles." "Our troubles now." She turned to face him fully. "Why? Why make my problems yours? I'm not your wife. I'm barely more than a stranger you've known 3 weeks. He thought about it, tried to find words for the feeling that had been growing since that night of the storm. "Because for 3 years, I've been sleepwalking through life, going through motions, existing but not living. Then you showed up uninvited, unwanted, unexpected, and suddenly I'm awake again. I'm angry. I'm worried. I'm feeling things I thought were buried with Martha. I don't know if that's love or just life forcing its way back in, but I'm not ready to give it up." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, moved to stand before him. "I need you to understand something. I'm not trying to replace your wife. I'm not trying to be her or compete with her memory. What I feel for you, it's different, harder, maybe less pure, but it's real." "I know." "Do you? Because if we're going to face Crowley together, if we're going to build something here, I need to know you see me not her shadow, not some idealized woman, but me, Margaret Doyle, with all her scars and sharp edges and inconvenient past." He stood, framed her face with his hands. In the dying light, her eyes held flecks of gold among the green and brown. "I see you," he said simply. "And what I see, it's worth fighting for." She kissed him then, different from that night in the storm. This was deliberate, a claiming and a promise. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, she stepped back. "All right then. We face him together. But Thomas, I won't lose another man to Silas Crowley. If it comes to choosing between your life and this land, it won't come to that." "But if it does?" "It won't." He pulled her close, felt her heart beating against his chest. "I'm not James, and you're not the woman you were then. We're both stronger now. Together, we're stronger still." She rested her head against his shoulder, and they stood there as darkness fell over the Double H. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called not mournful this time, but defiant, a claiming of territory, a warning to rivals. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Crowley would be back, in one form or another. There would be tests and threats and hard choices ahead. But tonight, Thomas held a brave woman in his arms and felt something he'd thought lost forever, not just desire or companionship, but partnership, the kind forged in understanding and strengthened by adversity. "Come inside," Maggie said eventually. "It's getting cold, and we need to eat. Can't fight on an empty stomach." Practical as always, even in the midst of emotional storms. He followed her in, watched her move around his kitchen, their kitchen, with easy familiarity. 3 weeks, and already she'd made herself essential, not through feminine wiles or calculated seduction, but through strength and honesty and the simple daily act of showing up. Over a late supper, they made plans: where to post watches, how to protect the cattle, what legal remedies might be available. It felt like preparing for war, which perhaps it was. But as Thomas watched Maggie outline strategies with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything, he felt an unexpected peace. He'd been alone so long. He'd forgotten what it meant to have a partner, someone to share not just the pleasant evenings, but the burdens, the fears, the fights that needed fighting. Martha had been his heart, his joy, his weakness. Maggie was proving to be his strength, his courage, his match. Different kinds of love, perhaps, but love all the same. The fire started just after midnight. Thomas woke to the sound of horses screaming and the acrid smell of smoke drifting through his open window. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before his mind fully registered what was happening. "Fire!" Jake's voice carried across the yard. "The barn's on fire!" Thomas burst from the house to see flames already licking through the barn roof, orange tongues reaching toward the star-filled sky. The horses were panicking, their terrified whinnies cutting through the roar of the fire. Half his breeding stock was in that barn, including Duchess, the mare he'd bought back east with Martha. "Get the horses out," he shouted. Running toward the inferno, heat hit him like a physical wall, but he didn't slow. Jake and Eric were already at the doors, fighting to get them open while Lars ran for the water pump. Maggie appeared beside him, her nightgown covered by one of his coats, her hair loose and wild. Without a word, she grabbed a bucket and joined the water line Lars was organizing. No questions, no hesitation, just action. Thomas and Jake managed to wrench open the barn doors. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking. The horses were beyond panic now, rearing and striking at their stall doors. "We go in together," Jake said, already tying his bandana over his nose and mouth. "Quick as we can." They plunged into the smoke-filled barn. Thomas could barely see, relying on memory and instinct to find the stalls. A hoof caught him in the ribs, sending him stumbling, but he held on, unlatching doors and driving horses toward the exit. The heat was overwhelming, sweat immediately soaking through his shirt. 6 horses out, 8, 10. The smoke grew thicker, the roar of flames louder. Part of the loft collapsed, sending a shower of burning hay down. Thomas heard a high, terrified whinny from the far stall Duchess. "Get out," Jake yelled. "The whole thing's coming down." One more. Thomas fought his way to the last stall. Duchess was pressed against the back wall, eyes rolling white with terror. He fumbled with the latch, metal hot enough to blister. The mare wouldn't move, paralyzed by fear. A hand appeared beside his Maggie, her face streaked with soot. Together they grabbed Duchess's halter, pulling and coaxing. Another section of roof collapsed. Burning debris rained down. Maggie cried out as an ember caught her shoulder, but she didn't let go. They burst from the barn just as the main beam cracked. Thomas shoved both women, horse and human, forward as the structure groaned. They hit the ground hard, rolling away as the barn collapsed in a fountain of sparks and flame. For a moment, Thomas lay there, lungs burning, watching his barn built with his own hands, filled with 3 years of work consumed by fire. Then Maggie was pulling him to his feet, hands running over him, checking for injuries. "You're all right, Thomas. Look at me. Are you hurt?" He focused on her face, saw fear there, not for the barn or the losses, but for him. "I'm fine. You—" She touched her shoulder where the ember had struck, winced. "Nothing that won't heal." Her eyes went to the inferno. "I'm so sorry. The hay, the equipment." "Just things. The horses are what matter." He did a quick count. All 12 were milling about the yard, frightened but alive. Even Duchess, sides heaving, had survived. It was only then, as the adrenaline began to fade, that the implications hit him. This was no accident. The barn had been secured, no lanterns left burning. And the fire had started in multiple places. He could see that now in the burn pattern. Crowley, Maggie said quietly, coming to the same conclusion. He did this. Thomas's jaw tightened. In the week since Crowley's visit, there had been small incidents, cut fence lines, spooked cattle, a poisoned salt lick they'd found just in time. Harassment, but nothing this bold, this destructive. Can't prove it, Jake said, joining them. His face was grim beneath the soot. No one saw anything. Boys on watch didn't spot anyone approaching. He's too smart for that. Maggie stared at the flames. He'll have an alibi. Men who'll swear he was playing cards in town or some such. They worked through the night, keeping the fire from spreading to other buildings, settling the traumatized horses, salvaging what little they could. By dawn, only smoking ruins remained of what had been one of the finest barns in the county. Thomas stood surveying the damage as the sun rose. Without the barn, winter would be brutal. Hay storage gone, equipment destroyed, shelter for the horses reduced to nothing. It would take months to rebuild, money he'd planned to use for expanding the herd. I did this, Maggie said beside him. Brought this trouble to your door. Stop. He turned to face her. Crowley did this, not you. Because of me, because I'm here, because he couldn't have me before and it eats at him. Her voice was bitter. Maybe I should... Don't. He gripped her shoulders, careful of her injury. Don't even think it. You think running will stop him, men like Crowley don't forget. He'd come after this place anyway. Eventually. Your being here just moved up his timeline. She searched his face. You're not angry. Oh, I'm angry, but not at you. He pulled her close, felt her tension slowly ease. We'll rebuild. Better than before. And we'll make sure Crowley pays for this. How Jake's right, we can't prove anything. Not in court, maybe, but there are other kinds of justice. The day brought unexpected support. Word of the fire spread quickly, and by noon, neighbors began arriving. The Pattersons brought food. The Millers offered timber. Even people from town who'd gossiped about Maggie came with offers of help. That's what Crowley doesn't understand, said Samuel Patterson, a grizzled rancher who'd been Thomas's nearest neighbor for years. We might squabble amongst ourselves, but when someone attacks one of us, they attack all of us. The barn raising was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, temporary shelters were rigged for the horses. Thomas threw himself into the work, trying not to think about the losses, the setback this represented. But at night, when exhaustion should have brought sleep, he found himself staring at the ceiling, rage burning cold in his chest. Crowley had come onto his land, destroyed his property, endangered lives, human and animal. The man thought himself untouchable, protected by wealth and influence and careful planning. You're plotting, Maggie observed on the third night after the fire. She'd taken to applying salve to her shoulder burn in the evening, and he'd taken to watching her, disturbed by how close she'd come to serious injury. Just thinking, dangerous occupation for a man with that look in his eyes. She set aside the salve, came to sit beside him on the porch. What are you planning, Thomas? He was quiet for a long moment. Crowley owns the bank in Cedar Valley, has interests in several businesses there, but his real money comes from selling cattle to the army, big contracts, very profitable. And armies are particular about their beef. Any hint of disease, any question about the quality, and contracts get canceled, reputations ruined. Maggie studied him. You're not thinking of poisoning his herd? No, nothing so crude. But information has a way of traveling. If certain rumors reach certain ears, that's dangerous. Crowley's not a forgiving man. Neither am I. He looked at her. He came after what's mine. Tried to destroy it. You think I should turn the other cheek? No. Her voice was fierce. I think you should destroy him, but carefully, cleverly, the way he operates. She was quiet for a moment. I might be able to help. How? I still have friends in New Mexico. People who knew James, who know exactly how Crowley operates. They might have information documents, witnesses, things that could be useful. Thomas felt a flicker of hope. Fighting Crowley with fists or guns would be satisfying, but futile. The man had too many resources, too much protection. But fighting him with his own weapons information, influence, carefully applied pressure. Right to them, he said, quietly. We need to know everything: his debts, his enemies, his secrets. Everyone has vulnerabilities. Even you. He looked at her, this woman who'd become essential to him in ways he was still discovering. Especially me. The barn raising took place on a clear November day. It seemed half the county had turned out, men with hammers and saws, women with food and encouragement. Thomas watched in amazement as his barn rose from the ashes, better and stronger than before. Maggie worked alongside the women, but Thomas caught several men watching her with new respect. The story had gotten out how she'd risked the fire to save Duchess, how she'd worked through the night without complaint. Public opinion, that fickle wind, was shifting in her favor. She's good for you, Samuel Patterson observed, following Thomas's gaze. Martha was a sweet girl, but fragile. This one's got steel in her. You'll need that for what's coming. What do you mean? Crowley was in town yesterday, buying drinks, talking loud about expansion plans. Man's got appetite, and this little setback won't stop him. Patterson spat tobacco juice. Course, he also seemed mighty surprised the whole county turned out to help you rebuild. Don't think he counted on that. By evening, the barn stood complete raw wood that would need painting, empty of hay and equipment, but solid and real. People drifted away with handshakes and promises of future help if needed. Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, not just neighborliness, but community, connection. It's beautiful, Maggie said, standing beside him as the last wagons rolled away. Better than the old one. Different, he agreed. But maybe different is what we need. She slipped her hand into his. I heard from my friend in Santa Fe. She has information papers that prove Crowley was skimming from Army contracts, bribing suppliers. Nothing recent enough for prosecution, but enough to interest his current business partners. Good. We'll need leverage when he makes his next move. You think he will? I know he will. Men like him can't stand being defied. He'll escalate. Thomas squeezed her hand. But we'll be ready. That night, for the first time since the fire, he slept soundly. The barn stood sentinel in the darkness, proof that what Crowley destroyed, they could rebuild. The horses were safe in their new stalls. Maggie was safe in her room down the hall. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. Crowley had drawn first blood, thinking them weak. He was about to learn otherwise. The widow he'd tormented and the widower he'd tried to break had found something in each other, not just love or desire, but partnership forged in fire. The war for the Double H had begun, but Thomas, holding the memory of Maggie's hand in his, felt ready for whatever came next. Some battles were worth fighting. Some things, some people were worth any risk. In her room, Maggie lay wakeful, shoulders still aching from the burn. She thought of James, of how he'd faced Crowley with bluster and pride and paid the ultimate price. Thomas was different, quieter, smarter, more dangerous in his controlled fury. She'd loved James with the passion of youth, all heat and no foundation. What she felt for Thomas was deeper, built on respect and understanding and the simple daily choice to stand together against whatever came. Through her window, the new barn stood silhouetted against the stars. From ashes, resurrection. From loss, new strength. It seemed a promise, a metaphor for everything her life had become since that day she'd stepped off the stage instead of Catherine Mills. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd found something worth fighting for, not just land or pride, but a future neither had dared imagine when they'd started this awkward dance just weeks ago. The coyotes howled in the distance, but the sound no longer seemed mournful. It was a battle cry, a declaration We are here. We survive. We endure. And in the morning, they would begin to fight back. The summons came on a cold December morning. Delivered by Sheriff Ben Watson himself. Thomas read the single line 3 times before the words sank in. Silas Crowley formally challenged him to settle their dispute at noon in the town square. "It's legal," Watson said apologetically, shifting his weight on the porch. "Old ordinance still on the books. Man has the right to call for satisfaction in matters of property and honor." "Since when does Crowley care about doing things legal?" Maggie asked from the doorway. The sheriff touched his hat to her. "Ma'am, since he realized other methods weren't working, I'd guess this way. If Thomas refuses, Crowley can claim cowardice. Use it to pressure business associates, banks, make life difficult." Thomas folded the paper slowly. "And if I accept?" "Then you face each other at noon. First blood or yield." Watson looked uncomfortable. "I have to be there. Make it official. But Thomas, Crowley's brought in a gun hand from Texas. Man named Cole Ritter. Fast as they come." "He won't be doing his own fighting then." Thomas said, "Terms allow for seconds. Each man can choose a representative." The sheriff paused. "I shouldn't say this, but most folks in town are hoping you put Crowley in his place. Man's been throwing his weight around too long." After Watson left, Thomas found Maggie in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. "You can't," she said without looking at him. "This is what he wants. What he did to James provoked him into a fight he couldn't win. This is different." "How?" She whirled on him. "Because you're a better shot, because you're smarter. None of that matters when you're facing a professional killer." He crossed to her, took her shoulders gently. "Because I won't be facing him. I'll name my own second. Who, Jake's solid, but he's no gunfighter. The Svensson boys are too young." "I was thinking of asking you." The words hung between them. Maggie's eyes widened. "Women can't—" "Ordinance says person of good standing. Doesn't specify gender, and you told me you could shoot. Shooting cans and shooting men are different things." "Are they?" He studied her face. "You faced down rustlers in New Mexico, held off claim jumpers after James died. You think I don't know what that cost you, what you had to do to survive?" She pulled away, walked to the window. "I've done things, yes, but this— Thomas, if something goes wrong, if Crowley's man is faster, do you trust me?" "That's not— Do you trust me?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes." "Then, trust me now. Crowley expects me to show up with some ranch hand, someone Ritter can outdraw easily. He doesn't expect you. More importantly, he underestimates you, always has. And if his man doesn't, if Ritter sees me as a real threat, then we'll handle it, together, like we've handled everything else." She turned back to him, and he saw the war in her face, fear fighting with something fiercer. "You're gambling everything on my ability to face down a killer." "No, I'm betting everything on the woman who ran into a burning barn for a horse she'd never met, who faced down a town's judgment without flinching, who survived Crowley once and came out stronger." He touched her face gently. "I'm betting on you. Maggie, question is, will you bet on yourself?" The rest of the morning passed in preparation. Word spread quickly Thomas Hale had accepted Crowley's challenge. Would meet him at noon. What spread slower, but with more impact, was the news of who his second would be. "A woman," Jake said when Thomas told him. "Boss, no disrespect to Mrs. Doyle, but—" "You ever see her shoot?" Thomas interrupted. "Well, no, but—" "I have—" This from Eric Svensson, who'd been cleaning tack nearby. "Saw her practicing behind the barn last week. Put 6 shots in a playing card at 20 paces. Never seen anything like it outside a traveling show." Thomas looked at Maggie, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "You've been practicing—" Seemed prudent, given the circumstances. She met Jake's skeptical gaze. "I may not be what you expected, Mr. Morrison, but I'll stand for Thomas. That's what matters. At 1:45, they rode into Silver Creek. The town was bustling. Word of the challenge had brought people from miles around. Thomas spotted ranchers, townspeople, even some folks from Cedar Valley come to watch their boss in action. Crowley stood in the center of the square, dressed in an expensive black suit that made him look like an undertaker. Beside him stood Cole Ritter, tall, lean, with the dead eyes of a man who'd killed so often it had ceased to mean anything. "Hail," Crowley called out as they approached. "Glad you found the courage to show, though I expected you to bring someone more substantial for your second." Thomas dismounted, helped Maggie down. She wore a split riding skirt and a man's duster that concealed her figure. Her hair pinned up under a flat-brimmed hat, but there was no disguising what she was. "Mrs. Doyle will stand as my second," Thomas said clearly. A ripple ran through the crowd. Crowley's confident smile faltered. "You can't be serious." "Ordinance says person of good standing. Mrs. Doyle qualifies." Sheriff Watson stepped forward, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. It's unusual, but legal, if both parties agree to the terms." "I agree," Thomas said. Crowley's face darkened. "You'd hide behind a woman's skirts." "No," Maggie said, stepping forward. "He stands beside a woman who's ready to face your hired killer. Question is, Mr. Crowley, are you ready to face the consequences of your actions?" The crowd pressed closer. Thomas heard murmurs, some disparaging but more supportive than he'd expected. Maggie had earned respect in the weeks since her arrival, and frontier people understood survival in all its forms. "The terms," Watson said, clearly wanting to get this over with. "First blood or yield. Second stand in for principles. 20 paces, turn, and fire on my signal." Ritter spoke for the first time, his voice flat as old beer. "I don't shoot women." "Then yield," Maggie said simply. "Or rethink your standards. I assure you, I have no qualms about shooting you." Something flickered in Ritter's eyes, surprise, maybe, or respect. He looked at Crowley. "You didn't mention this possibility." "Because it's ridiculous," Crowley snapped. "She's nobody, a used-up widow playing at—" The sound of Maggie's palm connecting with Crowley's face echoed across the square. He staggered, hand to his cheek, eyes blazing. "That's for James," she said quietly. "And for every woman you've tried to break. Now, are we doing this, or are you going to keep flapping your gums like a landed fish?" The crowd had gone dead silent. Even Ritter looked impressed. Crowley's face was purple with rage, but he nodded sharply at his man. Watson positioned them back-to-back in the center of the square. Thomas stood with the crowd, every muscle tense. He'd seen Maggie practice. Yes, but practice wasn't the same as facing a killer with live ammunition and death in his eyes. 20 paces, Watson called out. "On my count." They walked, Maggie's stride steady and sure. Thomas counted each step, heart hammering. At 20, they turned. Ritter's hand hovered over his gun, relaxed and ready. Maggie stood differently, weight-balanced, hand at her side, completely still. On 3, Watson said, 1. The crowd held its breath. 2. Thomas saw Crowley smirking, already tasting victory. 3. What happened next became legend in Silver Creek, told and retold in saloons and parlors for years to come. Ritter was fast, incredibly fast, his hand blurred, gun clearing leather before most could blink. But Maggie was something else entirely. She didn't seem to hurry, but her gun was in her hand and firing before Ritter's barrel had fully risen. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him half around. His shot went wild, plowing into the dirt. Ritter dropped his gun, clutching his shoulder. First blood, clearly drawn. The square erupted. Men who'd bet against the widow cursed good-naturedly as they paid up. Women who'd whispered behind fans suddenly cheered openly, and Crowley stood frozen, face pale with shock. Maggie walked to Ritter, who'd sunk to one knee. "You'll live," she said, not unkindly. "It's a clean wound, but I'd find a new line of work if I were you." Ritter looked up at her with something like awe. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" "New Mexico. Amazing what a woman can learn when her life depends on it." She turned to Crowley. "We're done here. Your challenge is satisfied. Come near the double H again, and I won't aim for the shoulder." Crowley's mouth worked soundlessly. Then, with visible effort, he found his voice. "This isn't over. You can't—" "Actually, it is." Thomas stepped forward, pulled out a sheaf of papers. "These came by special messenger this morning. Copies of your contracts with the Army, showing systematic overcharging, signed testimonies about bribes to procurement officers, all dated, all verified." Crowley went even paler. "How did you—" "I have friends too," Maggie said. "Friends who've been waiting for years to see you brought down. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this county, sell your holdings, pay your debts, and disappear. If you don't, these papers go to the federal prosecutors." "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Thomas smiled coldly. "Try me. See how far your influence extends when you're facing federal charges. See how many friends you have when the money runs out." Crowley looked around the square, seeking support, finding none. Even his own men from Cedar Valley had stepped back, distancing themselves from a falling star. "You've got a week," Thomas said. "Use it wisely." Without another word, he took Maggie's arm and walked through the crowd. People parted before them, some nodding respect, others just staring. Behind them, Crowley stood alone in the square, Ritter's blood soaking into the dirt at his feet. They didn't speak until they were well out of town. Then Maggie began to shake, all the tension and fear she'd suppressed flooding out. Thomas pulled their horses to a stop, helped her down, held her as the reaction hit. "I could have killed him," she whispered. "Part of me wanted to, for James, for everything Crowley took. But you didn't. You did exactly what was needed. No more, no less." He tipped her face up. "You were magnificent." She laughed shakily. "I was terrified. When Watson counted down, all I could think was, what if I miss, what if I fail Thomas like I failed James?" "You didn't fail James. He failed himself by not listening to you. And you could never fail me." He kissed her then, there on the side of the road, with the dust of Silver Creek still on their clothes and the echo of gunfire in their ears. When they parted, she was smiling. "So what now we've made an enemy of Crowley? Even if he leaves, he'll want revenge." "Let him want. He's finished here, and he knows it. Men like him are only powerful when people fear them. You broke that fear today." He helped her back onto her horse. "Besides, we've got more important things to worry about." Such as the fact that I'm in love with my hired help? Scandalous behavior for a respectable rancher." She stared at him. "Thomas Hale, did you just—" "Say I love you, yes. Should have said it sooner. Would have, if I wasn't a stubborn fool still fighting ghosts." He met her gaze steadily. "I love you, Maggie Doyle, not as a replacement for what I lost, but for who you are, for your strength and your courage and your absolutely terrifying accuracy with a firearm." She was quiet for so long he began to worry. Then she urged her horse closer, reached out to take his hand. "I love you too," she said simply. "Have for a while now, though I tried not to. Seemed foolish, falling for another proud rancher who might get himself killed." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "And neither are you. The months long past. Time to make this arrangement permanent. Don't you think—" "Are you proposing, Mr. Hale?" "I am. Marry me, Maggie. Be my wife, my partner, my defender against hired guns and anything else that comes our way." She squeezed his hand. Yes, though I warn you, I'm keeping my shooting skills sharp. Never know when they might come in handy. I wouldn't have it any other way. They rode home through the winter afternoon, hands linked across the space between their horses. Behind them, Silver Creek buzzed with the story of the widow who'd outdrawn a professional killer, who'd brought down Silas Crowley with courage and a steady hand. Ahead lay the Double H, their land, their future. There would be challenges still calving season, market fluctuations, the ordinary disasters of ranch life. But they'd face them together. Two people who'd found something unexpected in each other, not just love, but partnership forged in adversity and strengthened by trust. The new barn stood proud against the sky as they rode up, a symbol of resilience and community. In the doorway, Jake waited with a grin. "Heard the news already?" he called out. "Ryder came through. Said Mrs. Doyle put on quite a show." "She did," Thomas agreed, helping Maggie dismount. "Though I think it's time we stopped calling her Mrs. Doyle." Jake's grin widened. "About time, boss. When's the wedding?" Thomas looked at Maggie, who was smiling despite her exhaustion. "Soon as possible. No point in waiting when you know what you want." "And what do you want?" Maggie asked softly. This life, the future we'll build together." He pulled her close, not caring who saw. "Everything I thought I'd lost forever, you've given back to me. Different than before. Maybe, but better. Stronger. Forged in fire." She agreed, thinking of the barn, the challenges, the moment she'd faced down a killer and won. As the sun set over their land, painting the mountains crimson and gold, Thomas knew the ghosts were finally at rest. Martha would have approved, he thought. Would have liked Maggie's strength, her fierce protectiveness, her refusal to be anything less than herself. The past was honored but no longer binding. The future stretched ahead, full of promise and possibility. And, in the present, a mail-order bride who'd never arrived had given way to something infinitely better, a partner, a lover, a woman who could stand beside him against any storm. Thomas Hale had paid for innocence, but found salvation in experience, found passion not in youth, but in wisdom, found love not in replacing what was lost, but in embracing what life had unexpectedly delivered. The coyotes would howl again tonight, but now their song seemed less like mourning and more like celebration, wild voices raised to the stars, proclaiming that life, despite all odds, continues, that love, however unlikely, endures. That sometimes the best things come not from careful plans, but from the courage to accept what fate provides and make it into something extraordinary. The recovery was harder than the injury. Thomas lay in their bed, truly, their bed now, no longer haunted by ghosts fighting waves of pain from the bullet wound in his side. Crowley's parting shot, fired from ambush on the road to town 3 days after the duel, had found its mark before Jake's rifle brought the man down. "Stop fidgeting," Maggie ordered, changing his bandages with practiced efficiency. "You'll tear the stitches." "I need to check the cattle. The boys are moving them to winter pasture today." "The boys can handle it. Your job is to lie still and heal." Her hands were gentle despite her stern tone. "You've lost enough blood to fill a wash basin. You're lucky the bullet passed clean through." "Lucky," he muttered, then caught her hand. "I'm sorry." "For what? Getting shot, being stubborn, scaring me half to death?" Her voice cracked on the last words. "All of it, but mostly for not seeing the ambush coming. Should have known Crowley wouldn't leave quietly." "He's gone now, really gone." There was a darkness in her voice that hadn't been there before. After Jake had brought Thomas home, bleeding and barely conscious, Maggie had ridden out with Sheriff Watson to identify Crowley's body. She'd returned hours later, grim and silent, and hadn't spoken of what she'd seen. "Maggie." "Hush," she finished with the bandages, pulled the covers up. "Rest, I'll bring you some broth in a bit." But he caught her wrist as she turned away. "Talk to me, please." She sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly looking exhausted. What do you want me to say? That I'm glad he's dead, I am. That I wanted to put another bullet in him for good measure, I did. What does that make me? Human, protective, mine. Yours, she agreed, voice soft. When Jake rode in with you slumped over your saddle, blood everywhere. I thought I'd lost you, just like James. And I realized something. What? That I'd kill anyone who tried to take you from me. Without hesitation, without mercy. That's who I am now. Thomas, not the innocent bride you ordered. Not even the widow who stepped off that stage. I'm something harder. Something forged by necessity. She met his eyes. Can you live with that? He pulled her down beside him, careful of his wound. Can I live with a woman who'd fight for me, kill for me, face down the devil himself to keep me safe? Yes, Maggie, I can live with that. Question is, can you? She curled against his good side, and he felt her tears dampen his shirt. I was so scared, she whispered. When I saw that blood, when you weren't moving, I kept thinking, not again, I can't do this again. You won't have to. I'm too stubborn to die. He stroked her hair, felt her slowly relax. Besides, we have a wedding to plan. Can't very well get married if I'm dead. She laughed, watery but real. True, though at this rate, we'll be saying our vows with you propped up on crutches. Worth it to make you officially mine. A knock at the door interrupted them. Come in, Maggie called, sitting up and wiping her eyes. The door opened to reveal a small figure, a girl of about 7, with Thomas's dark hair and Martha's delicate features. Ellie, who'd been staying with the Pattersons since her mother's death, visiting her father only occasionally. The arrangement that had seemed best for a grieving child now felt wrong. Another symptom of the half-life Thomas had been living. Papa, Ellie's voice was uncertain. Mrs. Patterson said you were hurt. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little banged up. Thomas tried to sit up straighter, winced at the pull on his stitches. Come here, let me see you. Ellie approached slowly, eyes wide as she took in the bandages, the pale cast to his skin. Then her gaze shifted to Maggie, still sitting on the bed. And something shifted in her expression. You're the lady from town, she said. The one who shot that bad man. I am, Maggie said simply. Is that all right with you? Ellie studied her with that disconcerting directness children possess. Mrs. Crawford said you're not a proper lady, that you're too bold. Mrs. Crawford is entitled to her opinion, Maggie replied. What do you think? I think... Ellie moved closer, still staring. I think you smell nice, like cookies and sunshine. Mama smelled like flowers, but they made her sneeze sometimes. Thomas's heart clenched. This was the first time Ellie had mentioned Martha without tears. Thank you, Maggie said softly. That's a lovely thing to say. Would you like to sit with us for a while? I could tell you a story, if you'd like. Oh, what kind of story? Oh, I know all sorts. Adventures in the desert, wild horses, buried treasure, or quieter ones, about families and homes and finding where you belong. Ellie climbed onto the bed carefully, settling between them. Tell me about finding where you belong. I don't always know where that is anymore. Maggie glanced at Thomas over the child's head, a question in her eyes. He nodded, throat tight. And so she began to weave a tale about a little bird who lost her nest in a storm and had to find a new home, meeting friends and facing challenges along the way. As her voice filled the room, warm and comforting, Thomas watched his daughter slowly relax, leaning into Maggie's side. By the time the story ended with the bird finding not just a new nest, but a whole new family to share it with, Ellie was fighting sleep. Will you stay? The child asked drowsily. Here, I mean, with Papa and me? If you'll have me, Maggie said. I'd like that very much. Good. Papa needs someone to take care of him. He's not very good at it himself. Ellie yawned. And I need... What do you need, sweetheart? Thomas asked gently. A mama who won't go away, Ellie whispered, and was asleep before either adult could respond. They sat in silence, the sleeping child between them, weight of her words settling like snow. Finally, Maggie spoke. I can't replace her mother. I'm not asking you to, but maybe you can be something else, something new. A stepmother. She tested the word. I never imagined. Children weren't part of the bargain when I answered that advertisement. Plans change. People change. He reached across Ellie to take Maggie's hand. You don't have to decide now, but I want you to know you're not just marrying me. You'd be taking on both of us. That's a lot to ask. It is. She agreed. Then, softer. But I've already lost one child. Maybe this is a second chance. For all of us. Over the next days, as Thomas slowly healed, a new rhythm developed. Ellie, who'd been brought to stay during her father's recovery, attached herself to Maggie like a small shadow. They baked bread together, fed the chickens, worked on Ellie's letters. The child bloomed under the attention, laughing more in a week than she had in the past year. The town's reaction was mixed but generally warming. The story of Maggie facing down Crowley's ambush, of her riding out with the sheriff to ensure justice was done, had spread. Women who'd whispered behind fans now nodded respectfully. Men who'd leered now tipped their hats with genuine courtesy. You've become quite the local heroine, Mrs. Patterson observed, visiting with a pot of soup. My herald says you've got more sand than most men he knows. I did what needed doing, Maggie said, uncomfortable with the praise. Yes, well, that's more than most manage. The older woman studied her shrewdly. That little girl is already half in love with you. You know, be careful with her heart. She's had enough loss. I know. Maggie watched Ellie playing with the barn cats through the window. I won't hurt her. I couldn't. Good, because if you did, Thomas wouldn't be the only one you'd answer to. Mrs. Patterson's stern expression softened. But I don't think you will. You're good for them, both of them. This house needed life again. The wedding was set for Christmas Eve, a quiet ceremony with just close friends and neighbors. Thomas was well enough to stand, though he still moved carefully. Maggie had ordered a simple dress from town cream-colored rather than white, acknowledging her widowed status, but beautiful in its simplicity. The night before, she found him on the porch, watching the stars. Second thoughts, she asked, joining him. No. No. She leaned against his good side. Though I am nervous. It's been a long time since I was a bride. And never a stepmother. Ellie adores you already. Now she does. But what about when I have to discipline her? When I'm not the fun story lady, but the one making rules? Then she'll push boundaries and you'll set them and life will go on. Thomas said, That's what families do. Families, Maggie repeated. Is that what we are? That's what we're becoming. He turned to face her fully. Maggie, I need you to know something. What I feel for you, it's not what I felt for Martha. It's different. Not more or less, just different. I know. And you're all right with that. Thomas, what I feel for you isn't what I felt for James either. We're not the same people we were then. Thank God for it. She cupped his face. We're better, stronger. We've earned this happiness, don't you think? Yes, he said simply. Yes, we have. The wedding day dawned clear and cold. Frost painting the windows with delicate patterns. The small church in Silver Creek was packed, everyone wanting to witness the union of Thomas Hale and the widow who'd tamed Silas Crowley. Ellie served as flower girl, scattering dried wildflowers with solemn concentration. Jake stood as Thomas's best man, beaming with satisfaction. And Maggie walked down the aisle alone, needing no one to give her away. She was her own woman, making her own choice. The vows were simple, traditional, but when Thomas slipped the ring on her finger, a new ring, not Martha's, his hands were steady, and when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared held promise of all the years to come. At the reception in the church hall, Ellie fell asleep in Maggie's lap, worn out from excitement. Sheriff Watson raised a toast to the finest shot in the county and the bravest woman I know. Even Mrs. Hartwell, that bastion of propriety, offered congratulations that seemed almost sincere. "It's not the wedding I imagined as a girl," Maggie told Thomas as they danced carefully, mindful of his healing wound. No grand ballroom, no orchestra, no honeymoon in Europe. Disappointed? No. She smiled up at him. "This is better, real, honest hours." Late that night, after the guests had gone and Ellie was tucked in bed, they stood together in what was now truly their bedroom. The ghosts were gone, exorcised by time and choice and the simple act of moving forward. "Mrs. Hale," Thomas said, testing the words. "How does it feel?" "Right," she said simply. "It feels right." Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white, a new beginning, washing away the blood and ashes of recent trials. In the barn, horses nickered softly. From down the hall came the sound of Ellie's peaceful breathing. "I love you," Thomas said. "My unexpected bride, my defender, my partner." "And I love you," Maggie replied. "My second chance, my stubborn rancher, my home." They stood together at the window, watching the snow fall, building their future one shared moment at a time. The mail-order bride he'd paid for had never arrived. Instead, life had delivered something far more precious, a woman who'd already been broken and rebuilt, who knew that love wasn't about perfection but about choosing each other again and again, through fire and storm and all the trials that would surely come. The coyotes were silent tonight. The world hushed under its blanket of snow, and in the warmth of their home, a new family slept peacefully, bound not by blood or obligation but by choice and love and the fierce determination to protect what they'd found in each other. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, Thomas Hale held his wife his true wife and knew that sometimes the best gifts come in unexpected packages, delivered by fate when we're finally ready to receive them. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the Montana landscape with a painter's touch. The Double H Ranch sprawled beneath endless skies, its pastures green with new grass, its cattle fat and content. Thomas stood on the porch he'd built with his own hands, watching his daughter chase butterflies through the wildflowers while his wife tended her garden. 5 months had passed since their Christmas Eve wedding. 5 months of building a life together, learning each other's rhythms, creating new traditions while honoring old ones. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter and the comfortable sounds of family. "Papa, look!" Ellie ran up, cupping something carefully in her hands. "I caught one." "Gently now," Thomas cautioned, bending to see. A monarch butterfly rested in her small palms, wings slowly opening and closing. "Mama says they fly all the way to Mexico," Ellie said, using the name she'd chosen for Maggie just last month. Not Mother, which had belonged to Martha, but Mama something new and wholly theirs. "That's right, thousands of miles, following instincts we don't understand." "Like how Mama found us?" Ellie asked with a child's simple wisdom. "She came from far away too." Thomas glanced at Maggie, who'd paused in her weeding to listen. Dirt smudged her cheek, and her hair escaped from its pins in rebellious curls. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with delicacy and everything to do with life fully lived. "Yes," he said softly, "exactly like that." The butterfly lifted from Ellie's hands, spiraling upward into the blue. They watched until it disappeared, a flash of orange against the vast sky. "Supper in an hour," Maggie called. Both of you wash up. That means actually using soap. Ellie Mae. Yes, Mama, Ellie sang out, skipping toward the house. Thomas lingered, watching Maggie return to her gardening. She'd insisted on planting vegetables, practical crops that would feed them through winter. But she'd also added roses climbing the porch posts, lavender by the kitchen door, wildflower seeds scattered along the fence line. You're staring, she said without looking up. Admiring, he corrected, joining her among the garden rows. My wife, the frontier farmer. Hardly, though the tomatoes are coming along nicely. She sat back on her heels, surveying her work with satisfaction. Barring disaster, we'll have enough to put up preserves. Maggie's famous preserves. We could sell them in town, make our fortune. Our fortune's already made. She gestured, encompassing the ranch, the house, the life they'd built. All of this is more than I dared hope for when I stepped off that stage. He helped her to her feet, not letting go when she stood. Any regrets about the life you might have had if Catherine Mills had lived? Catherine Mills would have given you exactly what you ordered. A young, biddable wife who'd never challenge you, never force you to grow. She touched his face, tracing the laugh lines that had deepened these past months. Would that have made you happy? No, he admitted. It would have been easier, but not better. Life's rarely easy, but the best things are worth fighting for. She glanced toward the house where Ellie's voice carried on the wind, singing some made-up song, all the best things. That evening, after supper and stories and Ellie's prayers, they sat on their new porch swing Thomas's winter project, finally complete. The ranch spread before them in the gathering dusk, peaceful and prosperous. Jake wants to bring in those new Hereford bulls from Texas, Maggie said, reviewing the day's business. She'd taken over the ranch books, her quick mind for figures proving invaluable. The initial cost is steep, but the improved bloodlines would pay for themselves in 2 seasons. Thomas finished. Do it. I trust your judgment. Our judgment. This is a partnership. Remember? How could I forget you remind me daily? But he smiled as he said it. The ranch had never run better, their shared decisions proving sounder than his solitary ones ever had. A rider approached in the distance, moving at an easy pace. Not urgent then, but unexpected. Thomas tensed slightly. Old habits died hard after Crowley's ambush. It's Sheriff Watson, Maggie said, her sharp eyes identifying him first. Alone? Not trouble, then? Watson dismounted at the porch, tipping his hat. Evening, folks. Sorry to disturb your peace. No disturbance. Ben, coffee, Thomas offered. Thank you, but no. This won't take long. The sheriff pulled out an envelope. Letter came to my office, from a law firm in Chicago. Seems there's been some confusion about that matrimonial agency. Maggie stiffened beside him. What kind of confusion? Well, according to this, the agency's been investigated for fraud, taking money without providing promised services. The lawyers are offering compensation to affected parties. Watson handed over the envelope, including the full refund of your fee, Mr. Hale, plus damages. Thomas stared at the letter. The sum mentioned was considerable more than he'd initially paid, enough to buy those bulls outright with money left over. I don't understand, Maggie said slowly. They did provide services. I came instead of Catherine. Watson shifted, looking uncomfortable. That's the thing. Ma'am, according to their records, you were never officially employed by the agency. Catherine Mills was their only contracted bride for this territory. When she died, they should have refunded Mr. Hale's money immediately. But the letter, the one I showed Thomas, appears to have been improvised. The lawyers think Miss Mills might have arranged for you to take her place before she passed, outside official channels. You weren't stealing anyone's position. Ma'am, you were honoring a dying woman's request. The porch fell silent except for the creak of the swing. Thomas felt Maggie trembling beside him and pulled her closer. "Catherine knew she was sick," Maggie whispered. "She hid it well, but in those last days, she made me promise, said there was a good man waiting, a man who deserved happiness, made me memorize his letters, told me about the daughter, the ranch. I thought she was fevered, rambling, but she was so insistent." "So you came," Thomas said softly. "Not as a desperate widow with nowhere else to go, but to keep a promise to a dying woman." "Both things can be true." She met his eyes, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed. "I was desperate. I did need somewhere to go. But I wanted to see if her stories were true, if the man in those letters really existed. And he did. He does." She smiled through tears. "Though he's even more stubborn than she warned me about." Watson cleared his throat. "The money's yours by rights, Mr. Hale. What you do with it is your business. Just thought you should know the truth of things." After the sheriff left, they sat in silence, absorbing the revelations. The sky painted itself in shades of purple and gold, beautiful and ephemeral as truth itself. "Does it change anything?" Maggie asked finally. "Knowing I came here partly because of a promise only makes me more grateful." Thomas said, "To you, for honoring that promise. To Catherine Mills, who I'll never meet but who somehow knew what I needed better than I did. To whatever fate brings strangers together and makes them family." She leaned into him, and they swayed gently on the swing he'd built for moments like this. From inside came the soft sound of Ellie talking in her sleep, probably conversing with the imaginary horses that populated her dreams. "We should put that money toward Ellie's education," Maggie said. "Maybe send her east when she's older. Give her choices we didn't have. She might not want to go, might prefer to stay here, run the ranch. Then we'll teach her that too. Give her all the tools. Let her choose her own path." Maggie smiled. "A girl who can ride and rope and read Shakespeare, imagine the possibilities." "I'm imagining it's a bit terrifying." "The best things usually are." As full darkness fell, they moved inside. The house welcomed them with lamplight and warmth, the scent of bread rising for tomorrow's breakfast. Thomas checked the locks, another hard-learned habit, while Maggie banked the fires. In their bedroom, she unpinned her hair, letting it fall in waves down her back. He watched from the bed, still struck sometimes by the reality of her presence, his wife. Not the one he'd ordered or expected or thought he wanted, but the one he needed. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching his gaze in the mirror. "About chances, second ones, unexpected ones. The chances we take and the ones that take us." He held out his hand. "About how a man can think he knows what he wants and be completely wrong." She came to him, taking his hand, letting him pull her close. "And what does he want now?" "This, you, our daughter asleep down the hall, our ranch thriving, our future stretching ahead uncertain but unafraid." He kissed her softly. "I paid for innocence and got wisdom, paid for youth and got strength, paid for a stranger and got my heart." "Poet," she teased, but her eyes were bright. "Though you also got someone who can outshoot you, outride you, and definitely outthink you when it comes to the books." "True. My masculine pride may never recover. I'll help you bear the burden." They laughed together, soft in the darkness, aware of the sleeping child nearby. Outside, the familiar coyote song rose no longer mournful to their ears, but part of the ranch's nighttime symphony. Later, as Maggie slept beside him, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them here, the grief that had nearly consumed him, the loneliness that had driven him to desperate measures, the woman who'd arrived like a force of nature, shaking him from his stupor, forcing him to live again. He thought of Catherine Mills, that unknown benefactor who'd seen fit to send Maggie in her place, of Martha, whose memory no longer hurt but rested gently in the past where it belonged, of Crowley, whose evil had ultimately only made them stronger, of all the moments, choices, and chances that had led to this. A warm bed, a loving wife, a happy child, a prosperous ranch, a future bright with possibility. Thomas Hale had paid for a virgin mail-order bride. Instead, he'd received Margaret Doyle widow, survivor, partner, lover, mother, friend. The universe, it seemed, knew better than he did what he truly needed. And for that divine misdirection, that beautiful error, that chance that became choice, that became love, he would be forever grateful. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and changing. The seasons would turn, bringing their challenges and gifts. There would be droughts and floods, profit and loss. Joy and sorrow, the fullness of life lived honestly and well. But tonight, in the home they'd built together, the family they'd chosen to become slept peacefully. The mail-order bride who never arrived had given way to something infinitely more precious, a love earned through trial, strengthened by adversity, and chosen daily in 1,000 small acts of courage and care. Some stories end with happily ever after. This one ends with something better, happily ever now. The understanding that happiness isn't a destination but a journey taken hand in hand, one day at a time, building a life worth living from whatever materials fate provides. The coyotes sang their ancient song. The ranch slept under starlight, and in the morning, the sun would rise on new possibilities, new challenges, new reasons to be grateful for the unexpected gifts that arrive when we're brave enough to accept them. Not the ending Thomas Hale had planned when he'd sent money to Chicago for a bride, but the ending and beginning he'd needed all along. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts about Thomas and Maggie's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of unexpected love in the Wild West, please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night for more stories. Give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit the hype button to help more people discover this story. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, partners.